All right, so finally we are going to be looking at standard deviation. Our first example is from your Excel quick guide. They were looking at the standard deviation for age for a sample of 20 sixth graders. And just in case this numbers throw you off, I had to look back because I didn't know what they were talking about. So it's age in months. So we don't have 150 or 15-year-old sixth graders. I cannot even imagine that. But anyway, I digress. So we want to find our standard deviation. So exactly like we've done our other functions, find the box below your data set, go to Insert Function, and we're going to do standard deviation. So I'm going to search for it. And there it is. And we're just going to pick the general one. Don't worry about the P for population or the S for sample. We are looking at a sample, but we're just going to go with a plain and simple standard deviation. Highlight my data, press OK. So you can see that there is a standard deviation of almost 5 months for that group of 26 graders. All right, so now I wanted to move to another quick example, looking at the standard deviation for biology and math test final grades, so out of 100 points for 20 students. One thing that I wanted to show you all, just as a time saver, so we always have our IDs, so that represents our participants who we're either looking at their data or they maybe took part in a survey, anything like that. So we've got to label them. So if you have 50, it could be a really big pain to type 1 through 50 in these boxes. I know everyone's busy, so I wanted to show you how you can do that. So the first thing I'm going to do is type a 1 in the first box. And then I'm going to go up to my Home tab. Make sure I'm on 1, and then you should see under that auto sum that we've been looking at, there is fill. Fill's awesome because you can either fill down a series of numbers or the same content over and over again. You can fill it down, right, up, and left, so that's pretty awesome. But we're going to go to series for our purposes. And we don't want rows because we don't want it to fill that way. We want it to be a column. We do want it linear. And then our step value, we started at 1 and we have 20 students, so I'm going to have it end at 20. Okay, so right there you saved yourself a little bit of time, so that's always nice to find those little tricks. And we're going to do standard deviation for, let's do math scores first. Okay, so I just plugged in some dummy data for math scores on a test out of 100. So I'm going to find my standard deviation for this. All the steps you should be very familiar with by now. And it looks like there's a standard deviation of 16, a little over 16, almost 17, for my test scores, which is actually a pretty big standard deviation. If I'm curious, and I wonder if you are also curious, what if we were to look at average, median, and mode? Some of these you might be able to guess where they are, but really quickly, because we know how to do it, let's just find the average for our math scores. And again, I don't want to grab my standard deviation, just my data. Press OK. Okay, so my average score is 75, C, and I didn't plan to make that as standard as you might see, but let's also look at our median, so that midpoint. Curious if the midpoint is, I'm just curious to see what we'll find out. Gotta select my data. All right, 81. So there is a difference between the average and what was the midpoint, and that kind of tells me about the distribution of my test scores, certainly, and that will tie in with your standard deviation as well. As for mode, we could probably pretty quickly look at that and see if we have any repeated numbers, but if you just wanted to be super fast while you're in here, you could definitely go to mode and pull that information. It looks like 90 was our most frequently occurring score. However, that doesn't really tell us anything super important. I think based on our average and then the median. So all it means is that I think we had 2 students who scored a 90. Good for them, but that's not the most useful piece of information in this example. But it's always good to consider those things. I would, encourage you to try to do the same thing with a biology score. Throw in some numbers and then see, of course, what the standard deviation is, but then also look and see what comes out with your average, median, and then mode to see if any of that is practical information that you could use as an educator.